Kellen Isles is an expert lead auditor for Quality Auditing LLC and has performed hundreds of audits in a variety of quality standards in 13 countries. He's a member of the American Society for Quality and holds Certified Quality Engineer, Certified Quality Auditor, Certified Biomedical Auditor, Certified Pharmaceutical CGMP Professional, and Certified Supplier Quality Professional certifications from ASQ. He's also an exam reviewer for the ASQ CPGP certification and an Exemplar Global Certified Lead QMS Auditor for ISO 9001, 13485, and ISO IEC 17025. Isles holds a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Bucknell University, a master's in engineering from USC Viterbi School of Engineering, and an MBA from the NYU Stern School of Business. Kellen, take it away.
Great. Thanks for that introduction. Maybe to give a little bit more context on my background, I come from the medical device industry, and I've worked for a number of major medical device manufacturers, both in industry and as a consultant over the past number of years, and worked in quality, supplier quality roles in the U.S. and in more than 10 countries abroad, performing assessments in supplier risk management across a broad number of different industry standards. Really looking forward to a productive virtual session today with everybody who has joined. And before getting into the details, I wanted to provide a little bit of context about the topic. First of all, I'm assuming you, the listener, are a quality professional with experience in the world of quality systems and an understanding of auditing and supplier auditing in particular. Second, and I think this is pretty important to stress, I recognize and accept that on-site supplier audits are only one of a number of different supplier controls, supplier management techniques, and risk mitigation activities that are out there in industry. However, for the purpose of today, we're going to focus on this singular activity of supplier auditing and talk about what some common mistakes are and some ways to avoid those mistakes. And we're going to begin at the very start of the process, which is audit planning, and kind of work our way through the end. I'd also like to give some context about where the insight is coming from. As much as I'd love to take credit for all of this information, it's actually been a collaborative effort, and the organization, Quality Auditing LLC, has overseen the development and implementation of supplier auditing programs across a broad, diverse set of industries, including medical device, pharmaceutical, automotive, aerospace, and numerous ISO 9001 certified organizations. And really from small pre-revenue startups all the way through Fortune 50 organizations. And we've been able to aggregate information from these internal and external data sources and try to simplify this into a presentation for this broad audience. And I think we're in some ways uniquely positioned to learn from some of the mistakes that we've seen in industry and provide guidance so that you, the listener, can get the most out of your supplier auditing program. Just a kind of an overview of what we'll be talking through here. We're going to focus on 10 common pitfalls, and we're going to tackle them one by one and explain what the pitfall is and some actions you can take about each to avoid falling into the same traps. And with that, we will jump right into things. Mistake number one, poor risk identification. As I'm sure you, the quality professionals out there, know, risk identification is core to all quality decision making. It's a significant portion of the change that everybody has been talking about with the new ISO 9001 2015 update. Risk identification flows into requirements in other ISO and industry standards and regulations. And the expectation is obviously that the quality management system as a whole considers risk throughout. But the gap here is often that risk identification is not considered in the supplier auditing process. And it results in auditors who don't understand the risks of the suppliers that they're visiting, or the information is perhaps not even known at the organizational level. And ultimately, the risk identification is truly the foundation of everything we're going to talk about in today's presentation. What are some examples of risk that comes to mind that can be or are mitigated by a supplier audit? Well, I would imagine that quality is probably at the top of everybody's list, right? You're all quality professionals, and that broad-based risk is the goal up here, right? Well, there's actually a pretty significant number of additional potential risks that exist within a supply chain. And what I'd like to do is try and get creative and go a little bit beyond that. So maybe what we'll do is take a few seconds here and ask you to brainstorm, jot down on a piece of paper some potential risks that you've seen in your work in industry or experienced maybe as a consultant or an auditor yourself, and try to think a little bit more broadly about the types of risk that we might be able to mitigate or evaluate as part of a supplier audit process. So what we've done here on this end, hopefully you've all jotting a couple ideas down, is we've actually gone out and we've pooled some discussions with customers, had involvement from our auditors, and tried to come up with an interesting set here of different risks and perspectives across industries of potential risks that exist. And what you see here is a word cloud representing a number of different varieties of risk that fall into all different categories. And I wouldn't suggest that every organization needs to evaluate all of these potential risks. But I think the key takeaway here is that while there's no single method for risk identification, really the goal here is for you to understand and identify risks that are unique to your business and use that as a foundation of the next mistake here that we're going to be speaking about, which is mistake 2, poor evaluation and prioritization of risk. So step 1 is really identifying what the risks are, and that's where lots of organizations fail, is at the basics. Now let's assume you've done a nice job there. You've identified the potential risks that exist to your organization. Now, how do you take that and turn that into a meaningful evaluation and prioritization to drive your supplier audits? What a lot of organizations do is use a very rigid approach where they have maybe 2 or 3 buckets that they categorize their supply chain into, and that drives a fixed audit schedule or time frame that they are going to apply to all of their suppliers. And there's not a lot of opportunity to be dynamic. Unfortunately, that results in a limited return on that supplier auditing investment, because in many cases, what I'm going to call the wrong suppliers are audited, or perhaps the suppliers that are lower to moderate risk are audited instead of the high-risk suppliers. Unfortunately, that has an additional compounding effect. When management sees a reduced return on their investment that's being allocated to the supplier auditing program, that can also result in fewer resources being allocated to perform supplier audits in the long run. And that's going to that would result in a reduced budget for future supplier auditing programs. I've never heard of an organization out there that has unlimited resources. And I've certainly never heard of an organization with unlimited resources to go throw at supplier audits. So how do we manage that? We recognize that risk is not static, and we use data to drive dynamic prioritization of supplier audits. Now, there are lots of different data inputs that we can utilize to drive that prioritization, and that's going to be based on the risks that we identified in step 1. But some examples of those type of information and data that you might consider when driving this dynamic prioritization are, what is the overall risk of the product or commodity or service that you're purchasing, right? And how does that relate to your product that you're manufacturing for your customer? Obviously, a cardboard box manufacturer is going to have inherently different risks and perhaps lower risks. I think we would likely all agree lower risks than a contract manufacturing organization. So the overall risk by commodity type is probably not as dynamic, but may change over time as your purchasing mix changes from supplier to supplier. Additional data might be where are you in the life cycle of your supply chain. With new suppliers, obviously you are not going to have as much data to evaluate as part of your decision making. Existing suppliers, you're going to have lots of internal performance data to evaluate, and suppliers that you're transitioning out of, even if you're still using them, perhaps that's not a good use of your resources if there's a clear plan to transition out of the use of certain suppliers. In terms of internal performance data, most organizations have a pretty good handle on delivery data, perhaps scrap or non-conformance data. But other things you might consider evaluating are responsiveness, the amount of purchasing activity or spend that you're driving from your supply chain, and specific suppliers. And you also would want to consider external market data. For those in FDA-regulated industries, that might be information like 483s or warning letters. In addition, you might consider tracking the status of certifications of your suppliers. Are they ISO certified and are they maintaining it? You might also go out to industry and try to identify new or dynamic risks that have been identified within your competitive space, and or within your current supply chain. If you have an issue with certain commodity, is there a risk that exists of a supplier that provides that same commodity to different locations or product lines that needs to be evaluated? I think the goal here is to, again, recognize that risk isn't static and come up with a system. Often FMEAs or an RPN number are utilized for this type of risk evaluation, and input that risk data on a regular basis to drive your supplier audit scheduling. And the best practice that we've seen, or the most common manageable way to tackle this, is to do it on an annual basis. Certainly, if the data is readily available, it may be possible to do it more frequently. But it's going to be up to you to figure out what that right time frame is and how far out you want to be planning your supplier audits. And I think it's worth noting kind of the pros and cons of this. Obviously, one of the significant challenges that this can introduce is dynamic prioritization means that resource allocation is going to be more challenging. You're not going to necessarily know 3 years in advance what your supplier audit schedule looks like, right? You don't have the data from 2 or 3 years, in advance. But it can also result in, if done right, it may result in fewer supplier audits. You recognize you have the data to support not doing an audit. Well, there you go. You don't have to spend the time and resources performing less value-added supplier audits. And that brings us to the next mistake number 3. Mistake number 3 is you've identified your supplier audit that you're going to be performing an audit on, and when we get down to the actual audit planning, a tradition, it seems, within a lot of organizations is to just perform a one-day quality systems audit and cover the entire quality management system or some significant portion of the QMS. Further, when the audit is performed, there's not any real prioritization in many cases of what products or services to focus on, and ultimately that results in a broad, not deep approach of tackling your supplier audits. And there's plenty of reasons or excuses why it happens this way. It might be done out of convenience. It's certainly easier to write into a procedure that you're going to do a quality systems audit. Perhaps you've never audited a supplier in the past, and so it is providing some foundational understanding of the business. Or perhaps you're using auditors who are both internal auditors and supplier auditors, and internal audits often are going to be more broad in covering the full quality system because it's a requirement of the standard or industry that you work in. But I think a key question to ask yourself is, how many times has that supplier's quality management system been audited before you got there? And if the answer is it's been audited a number of times, then why are you looking at it if somebody else has already done it 5 or 10 times? Let's pick training as an example. How many times has their training program been evaluated, and how much additional value can you add by looking at their training program? Or would you be better off suited spending your limited time on site looking at something that is specific to your business or product risk? Say, looking at the validation of a specific product that's perhaps never been reviewed in a registrar audit or never been reviewed in an internal audit at that supplier. I think the recognition here is that the time on site is perhaps the most precious resource in the supplier audit program. And the goal here is really to make sure that we are focused on spending that time looking at the most value-added areas by narrowing in on, say, the high-running product or the high-risk product, and focusing in on specific risks or concerns that you might have, be it from nonconformances or complaints, perhaps process changes that has occurred at the supplier, and really making sure that you are able to allocate your time effectively during the audit. Moving on to number 4. Number 4 is around lack of experience on the audit team. So I suspect we've got a number of auditors in the audience today, and I'm sure this has happened to most, if not all of you. As an auditor, you're looked at as being an expert in just about everything. And as an auditor myself, I can say that certainly has happened, and sometimes I hate to admit it when I'm not an expert in something. But realistically, I think we all know that we can't be an expert in everything. And oftentimes, process experts aren't involved in the supplier audit program. Has anybody ever heard the excuse out there, oh, yeah, quality audits, they do all of the audits, the quality organization does that? Well, that's just not a reasonable way to think about supplier audits. I think we want to start with certainly a definition around what does it take to be considered a qualified auditor. There's obviously different methods for defining that. Is it training or some specific certification or certifications that are required, or industry experience? Across the board, there are a variety of different credentialing organizations. Some, well-respected and understood, like Exemplar Global, and others that maybe are less well-known, and kind of an alphabet soup of credentials and certifications that you can have. I think a key part of the process is defining within your procedures what are the minimum qualifications to be considered a lead auditor. And is that understood and documented within your company? It's important to point out here that while auditing is similar from internal and supplier audits, it's not the same. Certainly, good internal auditors would likely make good supplier auditors as well, but there's some additional nuance associated with supplier auditing that is related to the somewhat more delicate relationships that exist with suppliers. Certainly more ambiguity in the roles and responsibilities, and no direct reporting line or anything like exists within an organization. And ultimately, supplier audits can often drive significant decisions that have financial implications for the suppliers. And so, by extension, it becomes a higher risk and higher, more stressful role to be put in. There's other considerations that don't come up with internal auditing within an organization as often. Considerations around language and understanding what language the supplier has documentation in, what language is spoken on the floor itself, the process expertise. When you think about a supply chain, having internal auditors managing all of the broad, diverse products and services is likely much more challenging, and certainly there's a higher volume in the supply chain than there likely is within an organization. And it's possible and probable that by extension that an auditor is not going to have that expertise to audit all of those different manufacturing and service providers. I would say that we can probably all agree that auditing is a profession that can take an entire career to master, and you want to put your the right face of your organization out there to your supply chain to represent your organization. But it's possible that you may not have that expertise in-house, or it's possible that if you do have that expertise, it might actually run across a variety of different people and functions within your organization. And so the recommendation here is to acknowledge that auditors are not process experts in everything, and process experts aren't necessarily great auditors. And so a reasonable way to tackle this is to identify an audit team that can go and execute successful audits at the supply chain. And I think this is especially important where you have an auditing function that might exist in a big multinational, and they're not on site with the product itself. They may sit at a corporate headquarters. An audit team that has clear, defined roles and responsibilities can be much more effective than a single auditor who's expected to be a process expert. And then I suppose my shameless plug here at the end is don't forget that supplier audits are an opportunity to develop the next generation of talent. Bringing in somebody as a scribe for an audit is a great way for them to get an experience of what it's like to be involved in an audit, and set them up to get more involved as they grow their career. So there's our confused guy who's expected to be an expert in everything and can't quite do it. Mistake number 5. Mistake 5 is poor audit prep. So you've got the team, you've identified who you're going to audit, you've got the team in place, and now you go on site to perform the audit, and you find out that sort of one of two or maybe both things can occur, where you end up wasting a lot of your precious time on site reviewing information that you could have prepared and looked at it in advance, or perhaps information that you were expecting to be able to review just isn't available. Either way, that results in a less effective audit and less information that gets reviewed while you're on site with the supplier. As I had said before, time is the most precious resource when it comes to supplier auditing, especially where there's travel involved or have very busy schedules and accommodating you. It's often not possible to reschedule or come back easily. So good preparation is of high importance. And I think it's important to recognize here that gathering and reviewing the information is a time-consuming activity, and you need to allocate meaningful resources to it. It's not something you do a week beforehand. Often, especially with big organizations, that information can reside in many different systems with many different people, and might include a variety of both quantitative and qualitative information that you'd like to get from your stakeholders. The performance data that we had talked about previously, but also an understanding of projects that might be coming up, or general service and responsiveness, providing good customer feedback to the supplier, and maybe even using the on-site to have some teaching opportunities about lessons learned, about prior issues that have come up. So recognize that gathering that information takes a lot of time, and I would say that is perhaps doubly or triply important if you decide to hire an outside organization to perform your supplier audits. They're not going to have the institutional knowledge that your experts would. They likely would not have access to your systems to go pull information while they're on site, and ultimately are going to need to see that in order to be successful far in advance of the audit. Number 6, not understanding your full supply chain. This is probably pretty quick to cover, but embarrassing, I think, for many organizations, how often it happens, and how unfortunate it can be when it does occur. We've actually seen with many of our new supplier auditing programs, it's not uncommon for us when we roll out an audit program for someone who hasn't done a whole lot of supplier auditing in the past. It's not uncommon for us to find out that 15 to 20% of the supplier audits that are planned somehow run into meaningful disruptions due to poor information or understanding of the supply chain. And when you think about organizations that might be executing, 100 plus supplier audits in a calendar year, that's a pretty significant number of disruptions. We've seen a significant number of different types of data and data integrity issues and misunderstandings within the supply chain. Some examples include distributors who are acting as manufacturers or are perceived to be the manufacturer, suppliers who may have moved production facilities and notified you or not notified you of that move. But either way, the move is not well understood. Unexpected involvement of third-party logistics organizations. So an example of that might be your supplier is manufacturing a product, but then they're actually using a third-party warehouse to store the finished inventory and distribute the finished inventory to you, and that may not be known. Incorrect supplier data, just purely having the wrong information. Sometimes there's confusion amongst physical addresses versus billing addresses, or a point of contact that might be no longer with the organization and have left years ago. Some of that raw data in the MRP, ERP systems can be often obsolete or incorrect. Organizations who outsource key processes, and maybe that's not always understood. If you're going to look at a manufacturing process, do you understand what it is that they do and what it is that they have other organizations, sub-tier suppliers performing or sister organizations performing, and what do you really want to go and see? What are you planning on? What process experts are you bringing? Certainly, M&A activity can drive changes here as well. I guess the bottom line is any of these type of issues can throw a wrench in even the best laid plans. And the recommendation here is confirm and document all of this information as early in the process as possible, so we don't expend resources in the wrong direction working on incorrect assumptions. Brings us to number 7. Assuming we actually get everything all set up and you're ready to go and execute the audit, not preparing the supplier to be successful and know what to expect can be a common challenge. I think you have to, organizations take for granted, I think, their proximity and understanding to regulators and industry expectations. It's reasonable and realistic in many cases that your suppliers may not be as familiar with the industry that you operate in and the associated expectations. And they certainly, may not be familiar with supplier audits. It might be the first time they've been audited. And they're likely not going to be familiar with your unique process as well. And obviously the challenges of this is if you don't prepare them, you're going to impede your progress when you're on site. It's very easy to waste an hour or two because key personnel aren't there, or data is missing, or a process you were expecting to tour occurs a half an hour down the road at a different site. And so the key here is making sure that you're setting expectations for the supplier before you show up. And that starts with providing information to them in advance, confirming your basic logistics, providing a written agenda, and not providing it the day before. We would actually recommend providing that written agenda 30 days in advance, so that you can confirm all of the things that you're expecting to do and people that they're going to need to provide and times that they're going to need to block out in their day. And, ultimately respect your supplier as a partner, respect their time by giving them adequate notice to prepare for the audit. It's a lot of work for them to host it, and we want them to be successful. We want you to be successful, and making sure they understand what it's going to be like is the way to make that happen. Bringing us to item number 8. All right. Poor reporting. How many of you that are auditors have ever had someone ask a question on your audit report? If we were sitting in a room, I bet the majority of folks would have their hands in the air. On the flip side, for those who maybe aren't auditors or read other reports from other auditors, how often have you had a question on the report? Again, I think that the large majority of people can probably relate to that in multiple instances. Unfortunately, poor reporting is probably the norm, and that's even more challenging in the realm of supplier auditing because there's just so many more opportunities for challenges and discussion and debate and lack of clarity. You literally and figuratively may not speak the same language as the supplier, whether you're operating across geographic lines and language and barriers or across industry lines. If you think more broadly across an entire supplier auditing program, you're going to be working with likely multiple auditors in different geographic regions and a huge variety of types of products and services and manufacturing operations. And so, setting up a template for gathering this information and reporting it consistently is difficult. And I think, the other recognition here is key suppliers or key stakeholders in this process, the folks in purchasing, procurement, in upper management, 95% of the time or more are not attending the audit, right? So they're going to be entirely dependent upon what information is relayed back to them. And there's, dollars that literally hang on the line of the audit results. So in order to be successful here, we want to make sure that organizations define their process. How are you going to report the data? What information is supposed to be gathered? How are you going to classify audit findings to be consistent across all of these different broad folks that you're interacting with in industries and geographies? And then ensuring that this is defined in a procedure and process, really, and making sure that when you're on site, you're gathering all of those required information. Maybe you want to bring that scribe so that they can document the personnel that were interviewed and the specific procedures and records and work cells that you evaluated and looked at during the audit. And that you're planning out, as part of your audit prep, time for a detailed closing meeting. The goal of that closing meeting is to make sure that you're in agreement on the facts of the audit. It's possible and probable that you won't always agree on decisions arising from those facts, but you should be on the same page in terms of the data that you're presenting in your audit report. And a closing meeting is the right time to set that straight, to make sure that when you prepare the audit report, there's no discussion and debate over the facts that we're seeing during the audit itself. And then making sure that that detailed report that you've prepared with the help of your audit team is really routed to the various personnel that were involved in the audit for feedback and confirmation that what we saw in the audit, what we discussed in the closing meeting, is reflected accurately in the report itself. And that can certainly take some time, but ultimately, allocating adequate time for the report preparation to ensure the clarity and detail that's required is important and not insignificant. And the goal is to make sure that someone reading that report 6 months later knows what the supplier does, what is in-house and what they outsource, and that you have adequate details about issues that were identified for anybody who wasn't on site. Brings us to mistake 9, which is not communicating the results of your audit to the supplier. It's embarrassing how often that occurs, and the suppliers say, yeah, of the 10 suppliers, there was 10 customers who audited us last year, a certain percentage of those didn't ever even send us a report, so we don't know what we're supposed to do. And I'm sure there are reasons or excuses for why that occurs, right? Reports may have sensitive information, or there may not have been agreement on audit findings. If you do work with an audit team, it can take a lot of time to prepare that report. But ultimately, there's no excuse in not communicating the information to the supplier. The goal of the audit is continued risk identification and mitigation, and that in order to be successful there, that requires awareness from the supplier and buy-in from the supplier to address any potential issues that arise. And that information needs to be communicated. They can't be assumed to know what your process or expectations are. And so even if you don't share the entire audit report to your supplier, it's important to communicate in writing a meaningful summary of your supplier audit, along with any associated conditions, rewards, follow-up activities, and timeliness requirements, and to ensure that you are able to take the next step and actually address these issues. And one interesting way that we've seen this done well is making sure that you're tracking not only the execution of the supplier audit to the planned audit date or the audit schedule, but also tracking the timeliness of report delivery to the supplier and making sure that they're getting it in a meaningful time frame. And then that links us to the 10th and last item, which is the mistake of not tracking things to closure. Assuming you do everything else right and you provide the audit findings and action items to your supply base, a not insignificant number of organizations have not even established a process to track these action items to closure. And the net result is that you don't reap the benefit from all of the work that we just spent time talking about, because the activities may not be fully implemented or may not be effectively implemented. So the recommendation here really is to make sure that you have a defined process. What level of oversight is needed. And again, this can be risk-based. You don't have to necessarily go back on site to verify the effectivity of every audit result. For low-risk items, a simple notification may be adequate. But on the flip side, for those where you have significant audit findings, it may drive you to come back in for another on-site visit, or at minimum, a review of the audit plan and the corrective action and the verification of effectiveness information. So, recognize that it's reasonable and appropriate to use that full spectrum of ways to manage the oversight, and apply appropriate timelines to the various actions that are required. And in your process, ensure that whatever the documentation is that's required is defined and provided to your suppliers. And ultimately, as somebody famous once said, trust but verify. You want to make sure that you are showing up and you're going to recognize the full benefit of the supplier audit process. So that's the end. Tried to be pretty short and sweet here. What you can do if you're interested in getting more information is we've put together a quick summary of the 10 points that we've discussed today, and they're available on our website. And I hope you came out of this with some good lessons learned. Thank you very much.
This ends today's presentation. Thanks for attending.